cocinando.
Cocinando, sí. De chorizo.
Yeah, it's a preacher's kid. So I was a PK, and sometimes it can also be a professor's kid. And so I was doubly a PK because my dad was a Bible college professor who's also a minister. So my family was so different than yours that when I got a King James Bible, my dad gave me a vocabulary quiz to make sure I could read it okay, because you know, there was a lot of words that changed meaning since you know, James was king in England to the present day. So anyhow, I had to take a vocabulary test just to read the King James Version. I don't know about if anybody else here had that experience. It's probably unique. Also, my granddad and all my uncles were ministers, on my dad's side anyway. And it just sort of seemed like the family business. So clearly I grew up in a Christian home. During the week, you know, we went to church on Sunday night, on Wednesday night, whenever the church was open. We never got to see the Wild World of Disney on Sunday night because we were always in church. My cousin, they'd figure out how to get sick for Sunday night so they could go watch that, but we never did that. So I grew up being taught about Jesus, and I was baptized at church camp in 6th grade. I was the oldest of 3. I had a brother that's a couple younger than me, a couple years younger, and my sister's 6 years younger than me. So when I was a kid, I always liked math and science. I was a little slow figuring things out, but I started doing pretty well in school by the time I got into junior high and high school. In the summer, I'd always have a Cardinals game on the radio.
Ooh.
Yeah, well, that's because Aaron had the Cubs games on the radio. Occasionally that was the same game. But we took your announcer, so we had. I listened to Jack Buck a lot. So I played a lot of sports, but I wasn't so very good at that. I was kind of scrawny, so I wasn't quite one of the jocks, but I hung out with them a lot. But that, you know, not being a jock doesn't say much for me because I grew up in a little podunk town, so I wasn't the greatest athlete. I did play a lot of baseball, though. I did okay at school, but one thing that really made a difference was Bible Bowl. We do Bible Bowl sort of with a little different format than we do here, but where speed's important, you got to answer the questions really fast. And I never got fast enough that I could actually answer them, but it helped me a lot to think faster and to do better in school. I went from being the last person done with the test to the first person done with the test after Bible Bowl for a few years. So that was a pretty significant thing for me. I picked up woodworking in high school also. I took shop every semester. So, I've been doing that ever since. And then there was one particular day in high school that I remember, basically because I hit a home run in the baseball game, and then later that night I was inducted to the National Honor Society. And I don't know if you know me, the big thing was a home run. So I guess when you're in high school, you're just trying to figure things out. For some reason, I was always trying to improve, trying to achieve more. But at one point, I decided that I really had to decide what I believed about Jesus. And if I did believe in Jesus, it had to make a difference how I lived. And also my priorities. And so ever since then, I've tried to live as a Christian, to follow Christ, and really to be the same person in all situations all the time. So I went to college. The first year and a half, I went to Bible college half-time. I went to the community college half-time. A lot to save money, too, by going to community college. It worked out really well for me. Then I transferred to the university. We lived in Missouri, so I went to the University of Missouri at Rolla, which is an engineering school. And there I lived at the Christian Campus House there, so that was a really good place to stay. And there was one thing that was particularly stood out to me looking back, is that one Bible study. I mean, Scott, you really think you did a good job if, 30, 35 years later, somebody remembers a specific Bible study. But there was one that really stood out, and we went the whole semester working on memorizing the first chapter of James. And I'm terrible at memorization, but I know the first chapter of James really well. And if I study it for a few days, I could probably quote most of it with a little help still. So that was really significant. It was one Bible study, and James is actually a pretty good thing to study and to be able to, recall at times. So, and then another thing that I did in college is one summer my parents sent my brother and I to an archaeological dig in Israel, and that was pretty significant, and learned a lot about history. In some ways, you kind of learn that you don't really want to know exactly how they figure out what history was, because it's sort of like, knowing how things are made. It's not really clean and simple and clear cut. So it was kind of an experience there. So after I graduated from Rolla, I went to Purdue University for a master's degree. And when I sent my application in, they called me up and asked me if I was interested in acoustics. And so I told them no, but then the professor called me up and talked me into it, and now I've been working in acoustics for more than 30 years. So one thing I learned, a big lesson here, is be careful what you agree to work on, because you may not be able to get out of it and shake it. So there was a Christian Campus House at Purdue also, and I went to church there and was part of the campus fellowship, and ended up teaching lots of discipleship courses. And another thing I did is I played a lot of softball at Purdue. They had, probably 100 fields, and we were out there often. So I graduated, I got a job at McDonnell Douglas at Long Beach. McDonnell Douglas has now been sort of sucked into Boeing. But, I worked at McDonnell Douglas trying to figure out how to make airplanes quieter. I guess the other thing I did at Purdue is I met Nancy Fisher.
Amen.
And, after I managed to get some vacation at Douglas, I went back to Purdue and we got married. And then we hitched up a U-Haul trailer to her Chevy Chevette and drove to Los Angeles. Which, if you remember this Chevy Chevette, that was not the best decision we ever made. But we made it, so it worked out, yeah. We went to church at Knott Avenue Christian Church right down the street from Knott's Berry Farm. They had a really good young marriage group, and we made a lot of good friends there. But most of all, we actually had to learn to live together. And it was actually helpful because we were, thousands of miles away from our family and our friends, so we were stuck with each other and had to sort it out. So after a few years, they had some layoffs at McDonnell Douglas, so I volunteered, and before I knew it, I was riffed. So they used to call it reduction in force because it sounds better than layoffs, but basically, so I got laid off, so I went back to Purdue, worked on a PhD. I really liked being in school, but it was really good that I'd worked for a while because I had a better idea than most of what was important and what I needed to learn while I was in school. But that was a really great 5 years or so. Normally I don't go around telling people I have a PhD, so don't go spreading rumors or anything. So while in school there, we went to a little church in Lafayette, Indiana, and then the last couple of years there I served as a deacon. And so I finished up school again. I think some people thought I was never going to quit going to school. But I went to work for a small company in Ann Arbor, Michigan, and we were making software that helped engineers design quieter products. And we worshiped at a really small church. There was maybe 40 people on a Sunday. And one family had 9 kids, so they kind of dominated the church. But then after a while, the company that I was working for, they decided they needed to sell themselves. And I decided they didn't know what they were doing, so I was going to bail out. So we moved back to California. And this time we moved to Glendora, which is up by where the 57 runs into the 210. And so I've definitely picked up the California lingo since I can talk about the numbered freeways and not the interstate numbers. Anyhow, so I went to work at Jet Propulsion Labs, and you'd think working at NASA would be a dream job, but as it turns out, it wasn't a dream job for me, and I really should have known this before we moved. And looking back, I was probably a bit impatient and just wanting to change. But anyhow, we sold our house and moved, over 2,000 miles to a place where it's really tough to afford to live. And so anyhow, to me I probably made a mistake there. That was probably something that I should have, had more insight, listened to God, maybe recognized that there were negative signs when I was talking to him and interviewing and stuff, and sort of made a better decision, but I didn't. Anyhow, so we went to a church there in Diamond Bar. It was a great experience. It was a really great church. We got involved. Nancy and I became the church's bookstore, so we'd research books that we thought would be helpful for people, and then we'd buy a few copies and we'd sell them on the sidewalk outside church, because they didn't have room for a library at the church. So, and the preacher wanted to encourage the congregation to read, so we kind of did that. That was our ministry there. But while I was at JPL, we were sponsoring some research by a little company in San Diego, and I thought what they were working on actually had a chance to be the biggest scientific breakthrough during my career in my field. And so I went to work for them. And that was so much a better fit for me than JPL was. But being in a little company, there's a lot more pressure too. But working for the government, there wasn't very much pressure. So that was probably something I was missing anyways. But we found CCLG by looking on the internet somehow. This was in 2000. The internet wasn't really useful yet, but somehow we found this church. And our first visit was one of the last Sundays that we worshiped in this room. And our second visit was the first Sunday over there. And now this will be our 18th year in CCLG.
Amen. Wow.
So that's my story, how I got here. Looking back, I would say I'm still the same little kid, still trying to figure out what I'm doing here. It's interesting though. I still like baseball. I still read all the time. Still like math. Still a total geek. I hope I've learned some things, but I still have a lot to learn. I'm still trying my best to learn. I don't know if I ever really summarized my life before, But when Marcel asked me to tell my story, I wasn't sure what to say. You know, I don't have a dramatic conversion experience or an epic tale to tell. I did go on an archaeological dig, but it wasn't exactly like Indiana Jones. Yeah, and I didn't want to bore you with all my details. I hope I didn't. But there are some things I want to look back on. The first thing that sticks out to me is that as we build our life, our souls, day by day over the long haul. I'm sure I've told many of you this, but I believe that Scripture teaches that one of our main reasons for living is to learn to love God. And the more we do that, the better our experience in heaven will be. We don't see progress on a day-to-day basis, sometimes not even in a year basis. But over a lifetime, we need to keep the faith. I can look back, I can see progress, but it wasn't always clear at the time. And setbacks, like when you move thousands of miles to a job that's a mistake, well, it doesn't feel like progress. But God works even with your mistakes and can make the outcome turn out better than you would have imagined. In the letter that he wrote to Romans, Paul said this, and we know that in all things God works for the good of those who love him, who've been called according to his purpose. God can take our messes and turn them into beautiful things. Better than we would have ever thought. But I always wonder how much better it'd be if we didn't sort of start out in the hole. If we didn't handicap God by making a mess in the first place. But we just seek forgiveness and move on, and God works it out for us as good in the way that only he can. So another thing I can look back on and see is that we've been really faithful in church attendance, and also, you know, just always finding a church where we are, always being there, and you know, we're learning every Sunday, and also faithful about trying to find Bible studies, doing Bible reading and prayer. I'm not always as faithful with that as I'd like, but I'm working on it. Another thing is that everyone has a role, and sometimes we don't see it, sometimes we want to avoid it, but we need to find it, what our role is. And along those lines, you need to do something you're good at. You know, it's like if you're doing something that you can do, but it's a struggle, it's a lot better if you can find what you're good at and be doing that. I always thought it'd be really, really interesting to be a trial lawyer, but I would have been awful at that. I can't memorize anything. You know, it would have been better. I'm much better as an engineer. That was actually a good decision. I also wanted to say a little bit about money, just because Jesus talked about it a lot, and it often trips us up. So I grew up in the church and learned about tithing. And I grew up where money wasn't exactly much available. And so as a kid, I was always trying to find ways to mow lawns or do something to get some, so we could have some money. I've tithed as long as I can remember, but I wasn't always happy about it. I always felt that it was tough to have to get by on 90% when everybody else gets by on 100% of their income. It took me a long time to be happy to give. A few years ago, I was out at dinner with one of my old college professors, and he said that I must save a lot of money by not drinking. And I got thinking about that, and I kind of realized that how you spend your money, that's a choice. And everybody looks at the other people and thinks the grass is greener there. And, you know, it's not really. And so, you know, we make our choices, we do what we should, and God blesses us. And so when I read Jesus' teaching on giving, I don't really see him asking for a tithe. I see him asking us to be generous, to be enthusiastically generous. Much more than a tithe. I'm still working on it, but I made a lot of progress. So I feel like I'm not, I guess I'm not holding on quite as tight as I used to. Anyhow, our witness is built on top of how we live our lives. So our integrity is important. We need to be the same person at home, work, play, at church. I got to meet a friend of mine last summer. He was actually a college roommate of mine, and I hadn't seen him for over 30 years. And he was actually, he was a PK too. He was our preacher's kid when I was in high school, junior high. So I've known him for a long time then. And, you know, since I hadn't seen him, we actually we spent one evening, we walked around Paris and went out to eat. He happens to work in the U.S. Embassy and on counterterrorism, and he's a good guy, so it's a good. I'm glad there's good people working counterterrorism, as an aside there. But we were walking around, and afterwards he told me that I was the same person that he knew long ago when we were young. So that was a nice compliment, and I could say the same thing about him. But my goal is to finish the race, keep moving forward, become more like Christ every day. And I hope you'll join me in this. Thanks for your attention.
Amen. For the invitation to stand up here in front of you this morning. I was asked to talk about some of the things in my life and what God's meant to me. And I know now that God was with me from the very beginning until today, and I'm going to talk a little bit about that. And I'm standing here behind this podium. This podium belongs to the AA group, and it's usually kept on the side over there. And this will be my 4th or 5th time to speak behind this podium. I'll tell you a little bit about that later. This emblem up here means unity, service, and recovery. And to start off my life, I was born in a little old windblown farm town in Texas. There was no doctor there, but my dad got the doctor from the other next town, and he delivered me, and I was premature, and I was blue, and my heart wasn't working good. And the doctor told my dad that Mom would be all right, but the kid won't make it. And my grandpa was there, and he didn't buy that. And he went and got a nurse friend that he knew. She made an incubator, and she told him to go get some whiskey. And in Texas, most of the towns were dry, but my dad happened to know how to get some. They gave me a spoonful of whiskey, and in about 5 minutes I turned red, and that lasted for a little while, and then they gave me another spoonful, and then I was off and at them. And I know, even though it was whiskey, God was with me in the very beginning, and I owe my life to Him. My younger childhood was like normal kids. When I got 9 years old, my dad thought I ought to learn about work discipline, so he got me my first job. I was shoe shine boy at the corner barber shop. I kept the shop cleaned, and I shined shoes for a dime a piece, and I made $7 a week, and that was as much as some of the men that lived there. But most of the young men in town were gone because of the war, and because of that war, we had to leave that town. My dad was a fuel dealer. He delivered fuel to the stations and to the farmers, but there was no fuel because the military was using it. So we moved to California, and the first day here, he got a job at North Island pumping fuel, but this time it was loading aircraft carriers and other things like that. I had to get a job right away, so we lived close to a wrecking yard, and my job was to jack up those old wrecks, pull the wheels, break off the tires, and the ones that didn't have holes in them, they could sell because you couldn't buy tires. The ones that did have holes, they went into a reserve where they sent them away and made new tires out of them. And I made 50 cents an hour doing that. When I got in junior high school, my dad got me another job. I delivered papers for 2 or 3 years in National City. I had about 150 papers on the back of my bicycle. And you know, I also had to learn to get up at 4:30 every morning. And I'm still a morning guy. And I wake up in the morning and I think, well, I can hear my dad, "You should be working." So I'm still doing a little bit around, but not for money anymore. When I got into high school, I had my first truck driving job. I delivered flowers for a florist, and also worked as a dishwasher at a drive-in theater, or at a drive-in. That's when I got my first Harley, and I fixed up my bike. I could afford nice chrome and everything on it. And during high school, one of my classes, the teacher told us all that drugs were coming. And he said, drugs are bad. So what did we do? We just got drunk. So alcohol was our big thing at that time. And I started drinking at that time. I graduated from high school, took a 2-week vacation, and went down to Roar Aircraft in Chula Vista. And there was still kind of a shortage of experienced men, and I got my first job, and it was $1.05 an hour. And my dad had told me, if you ever get a chance, you should be a tool and die maker, because they get to work indoors. The wind's not blowing, it's warm and comfortable. So I managed to become a tool and die maker. And as the years went by, I always liked the money. I didn't mind getting up and going to work, but I always wanted to be kind of out in front. And I'm still kind of that way, but I've slowed that down a little bit. But I became an officer in the union. And I traveled for the union, going to conventions, and I was shop steward. And then I got promoted to foreman. Then I got promoted to general foreman. And then over the years, during that, I went down to Southwestern High School, or college, to study things that I thought I needed for my job. And I'm on the dean's list down there. So with my few credits, I did pretty good. I became a manufacturing engineer senior, and then I became a group manufacturing engineer. And in the later days, they sent me back to college. They wanted me to teach. So I went to San Diego State and got enough classes to get a lifetime teaching credential. And I learned a lot there. I became a teacher at Roar, teaching new engineers that they hired, and also teaching new tool and die makers about building tools. Then I retired. And we were talking about pickups at the table. When I put in my papers, I bought the biggest old Ford diesel pickup I could get, and I was ready to roll. All of my life, my dad liked to drive. On Sundays, we'd go for a ride, and if we passed a cafe and there was a couple of trucks there, he'd say, "Oh, that must be a good cafe, because there's some truck drivers." So they kind of became my, I really wanted to be a truck driver someday, and have that seat that bounced. And I found out about a free truck driving school that the state put on, and Dorothy and I went to that school. She didn't make it through the last because her legs were too short, but I made it to the end. And while I was there, at the end of it, I was voted #1 class guy. So here I am, bragging a little bit again, and trying to do my best and be out in front. Dorothy and I drove 18-wheeler, 750,000 miles for 6 years. We went all over the U.S. and Canada, and we'd be gone for 3 weeks, come home for a week, but she'd only go every other trip. Every other trip she'd stay home and be grandma. And she enjoyed both of it. And we learned to get along in a place smaller than your bathroom. And when you had a load to deliver and you were out in the middle of nowhere and you had a little fuss, you had to work it out. You couldn't go out in the back or over in the woods and go camping. You had to work it out. We learned to do that. Along the way, during all of that working time, Dorothy and I got married as teenagers. And we celebrated our 60th wedding anniversary here in the church. And, 2 months later, she was gone, and we had a wonderful life together. We gave birth to 2 sons. They lived a normal life. When my oldest son Harold got old enough, he joined the Boy Scouts of America, Troop 376 over at St. Philip's. And I volunteered to help out. And we hauled kids, we helped kids, and then when Harold and some of the others were getting old enough, like 15 and 16, they had their eyes on other things. And some of them were talking about leaving and going on, and the church wanted somebody to teach them a little bit about growing up and maybe even about manhood. They asked me to be a post advisor, which is like a scoutmaster, but it's for explorer scouts. So I agreed if they would let me set it up the way I wanted it, and I set it up as a hunting and fishing and wildlife conservation troop, or post. They gave me $200. I bought tents and everything I needed in the kitchen. I went to the fish and game department, and they assigned a game warden to my post. And he figured out work projects for us, like repairing quail guzzlers, and piling brush up for quail to live in, and working on trails. One of the interesting things up at Lake Cuyamaca, the lake is in 2 parts with a barrier in the middle, but at a good year, it would overflow that barrier and the top end would get full of fish also. And then when it dried up, those fish in the top end were going to die. So we would take a seine and go out there and seine fish, put them in a bucket, carry them over the dam. From little minnows this size to nice large fish, and we saved millions of fish. We fished in California, Arizona, Utah, Idaho, and Oregon. And during the years, the boys learned how to do car washes and make money, bake sales. They learned how to cook. Every boy left that could run a kitchen right now. They learned how to save their money and order meals for 15 people. So it was a wonderful experience for them and me. And we hunted dove, quail, pheasants. Went on a deer trip once, but that was just camping. We didn't have any meat out of that. One of the interesting things about the fishing, when we have our fish fry at camp, if somebody didn't put a fish in the skillet, he ate cornflakes. So I never had to eat cornflakes, but most of them did. After about 10 years of that, it was about the end of my term at that, because I was going to turn it over to some of the boys who grew up in the post. I was nominated for the Award of Merit. And that is the highest award an adult in scouting can receive. And what do you know, 3 men in San Diego got that award that year. Chief Collender, Chief of Police Collender, and a dentist, and myself. And I'm really proud to think that I was able to do that. Thank you. Next month is the Explorer Campout. Once a year, those boys are now grandpas, and we have a campout. So we'll be up on top of Mount Laguna next year having a post campout. Last year, they planted a cedar tree up there on the camp in my name. And, that's my scouting career, and that's a big part of my life. And, but during that time, I got to where I was drinking too much and too often. And I was about to lose things in my life, maybe my job, my marriage, and everything else. And so I saw that, and in 1981, I went into a rehab. And they gave me a physical, and the doctor told me he thought I had a disease, and if I did have the one he's thinking of, there's no cure, because you'll always have it. And the results of it are either death or you wind up in an institution. He said, I think you're an alcoholic. He said, if that's your disease, we can help stop the progress of that disease and help you go on with life. And he gave me a shot, and I don't remember the first 3 days, but the next day, in the evening, they loaded me up with the rest of the group and took me to my very first AA meeting. I didn't know anything about AA, and the joke used to be you didn't want to join AA because you had to go to those meetings, and just to being a drunk was better. But that was not true at all. And when I walked in, there was about 200 men and women in Lemon Grove, moving on from place to place, and it just nearly died. I heard it was down. I went to the meeting, and there was 10 people there. They were about ready to fold, so I came to the elders meeting, and we discussed it, and we got them in here. So every Friday night is the same AA group that I got sober in 36 years ago. So this means a lot to me. I don't want to talk a lot about AA because I could talk all day, but there's some things I want to explain to you. There's a little bit of misconception about people that have never been, and they think there's no God, or there's a weird God, but AA was written, the big book and the steps were written by Christians, and you were expected to follow that if you joined AA. There's 12 steps we follow. I want to talk briefly about 4 of them. First off, we admitted we were powerless over alcohol, and their lives were unmanageable, and that was true for me. And at that very first meeting, they asked, is there anyone here for their first time or a newcomer? And I stood up and I entered myself, introduced myself and said I'm an alcoholic. And God not only got me through that being a baby, He kept me safe through all of those years. God started taking over my life more in that day, and I haven't had a drink since then. Then step 3, it said, made a decision to turn our will and our lives over the care of God as we understood Him. Now that, as we understood Him, wasn't there in the beginning, but a lot of folks like me, going into AA, I didn't want to talk about God or hear about God or think about religion because I had turned my back on Him. And I was full of guilt. But I did get on my knees and take that step. That later on, down at the last, step 11, sought through prayer and meditation to improve our conscious contact with God as we understand Him, praying only for knowledge of His will for us and the power to carry that out. Now, by the time you get down to that step 11, which might be 6 months, a year, or 5 years, we're different men at that point in our lives. And by then, I had found that instead of God wants me to go to hell, God wants me to live happy, joyous, and free.
Amen.
Step 12, the final step, having had a spiritual awakening. As a result of these steps, we have tried to carry this message to alcoholics in all of our affairs. So, the spiritual awakening, I've had that. I love God now. And I still carry the message. I've still got men that I work with occasionally. Last month, 2 men called me, one from Arizona and one from New Mexico, to thank me because they had celebrated their 30th year of sobriety. And, oh boy, you can't imagine a feeling like that. Now I want to talk about my spiritual life. Wow, excuse me. As a child, I remember going to church with Mom. I remember getting pinched right here because I was wiggling too much. And I remember all those folks got to have a piece of the cracker and have a little sip, but I couldn't have it because I hadn't been baptized yet. I wasn't old enough yet. When I was a teen, the preacher let me know I was going to hell. So I said, well, party time. And I lived party time. Friday was party time and not good. When our sons got to be growing up a little bit, we decided that we wanted to raise them in church. So we started going to the Church of Christ over here in Lemon Grove. Dorothy and I were both baptized. The boys were going to Sunday school. I eventually became a deacon there. And one Sunday, I got a call that somebody couldn't show up, so I was needed to get up and help lead communion, but I had a hangover and I couldn't go. So I knew that I had to make a decision, and I chose alcohol. And even though I turned my back on the Lord, He helped me through my life as an alcoholic, kept me safe, I never hurt anybody, and I managed to get back and get that drinking stopped. When my mother died, Myron officiated at her funeral, and my son had arranged that. And I really liked what I heard from Myron, and I started coming to this church. And it wasn't long before I joined Christian Church in Lemon Grove. And that night when I was standing there in front of everybody, admitting God was my Lord and Savior, and Elmer walked up and stood beside me, and I never really understood that, because that don't happen often, but Elmer and I became like this, and we still are. The next Sunday I asked, where can I go to a Bible class? And I asked that Elmer, and he said, well, come with me, I teach one. So I'm still going to Elmer's Bible class. I asked, what can I do to serve the church and my Lord? And they said, go find this old tall man named Verdine and help him paint a door. It seemed like a year later we had painted every door on the property. And we got to know each other, and we connected, and he taught me a lot while we were painting doors, and he took me fishing. From then on until he couldn't go anymore, we fished together every Thursday. And you can't just talk about fishing all the time. He brought me through my advancement in the church. He helped me and taught me and encouraged me. I became a deacon. I taught the most excellent way, which is for a group of men here, mostly Christian men and women, who had drinking problems. And the interesting part was the same 12 steps were used in that, but it was in a biblical form, because all of those steps came out of the Bible. I was asked to teach Sunday school class at Monte Vista. I did that for a year, and then I became an elder, and I got to serve this church as elder. I got to the point that I was getting weak and tired from both my age and from my cancer, and so I had to withdraw from some of those things that Verdine told me to do as long as I could. Take care of this little garden out here and drag hoses and water. Well, I had to quit all of that. And something interesting has unfolded lately. The new schedule for those of us that stand before the church doing communion, I'm still in that rotation. And on December 23rd of this year, that's one of my rotating times. And that's also my 85th birthday. And I told my cancer doctor that, and she said, well, it's my goal to keep you going long enough to do that on the 23rd of December. So that's what's happened to me. God has been with me every step of the way. Even when I turned my back on him, he was there, and he was ready to get back in my heart when I was ready. So I've had Jesus through near death, childhood, a lifetime of work, 60 years of marriage, church life until today, and I'll be better soon.
Amen.
Crossing that river, and I know where I'm going.
Amen.
And I want to thank you for listening to me.